In the sleepy town of Providence, nestled within the undulating landscapes of Rhode Island, the air was crisp with the scent of pine, and the twinkling lights strung across Main Street glistened like a sky full of stars. It was the day before Christmas, a time when the whole town seemed wrapped in a warm embrace of festive spirit. Amidst the bustling streets and the occasional laughter of children, there was an undercurrent of nostalgia, a longing for connection that hung heavier this year. It was here that lives would soon intersect in the most unexpected of ways. On the corner of Maple Lane, tucked away from the town's main square, stood a house that seemed untouched by time. The edges of its wooden frame were softened by decades, and its porch creaked a gentle welcome to anyone who dared knock. Inside, Helen Dawson sat by the frosted window, her hands wrapped around a chipped mug of tea that had long gone cold. She was in her late 70s, her hair a thin silver crown that caught the faint light. Her eyes, once the deep blue of the Atlantic, now wore a glaze that came with age and the loneliness that accompanied it. Helen had spent most of her life in Providence. She was a retired elementary school teacher who had taught generations of the town's children their first lessons in reading and kindness. Yet now, her days passed in quiet solitude, with only the photos on the mantel and the faint hum of the radio to keep her company. Widowed for nearly a decade and with her only son, Mark, living states away in California, Helen's life had shrunk to the boundaries of her modest home. The ache of loneliness was a familiar companion, pressing against her heart like the cold of the winter wind that rattled her windows. But Helen was not entirely alone. In the quiet corners of her house, a small calico cat with a patchwork coat of black, orange, and white fur prowled with a confident, almost regal air. Her name was Clara, a stray that had wandered into Helen's garden 2 winters ago, battered and thin. Against her better judgment, Helen had offered a dish of leftover turkey one frosty evening. Clara, with eyes sharp as emeralds, had accepted with the hesitance of an animal who knew too well the cruelties of the world. But that was then. Now, Clara's presence was Helen's anchor, a tiny guardian who curled on her lap during late nights and watched her with an uncanny intelligence. It was Clara's second Christmas with Helen, and she sensed the tension in the air, the mix of melancholy and fragile hope that filled the rooms of the house. Helen had managed to string a few ornaments on the tree, their soft glow reflecting off the polished wood floor, but her old bones no longer allowed her to bend and reach as they once did. Still, she hummed softly as she moved about, her voice cracking on forgotten lyrics. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of snow. Street lamps flickered to life, casting long shadows that danced along the frosty streets. The town was slowing down, shops closing early so the shopkeepers could return to their own celebrations. Yet, for a few souls, the night would take an unexpected turn. Across town, a man in his 40s, his face lined with the exhaustion of too many long nights and too few quiet moments, was weaving his car down the icy roads. Mark Dawson gripped the wheel tightly, his knuckles pale in the dim light. He had made the decision only hours earlier to drive the 14 hours from San Francisco, spurred by a deep-seated guilt that had gnawed at him since the last time he'd called his mother. A brief exchange on Thanksgiving, rushed and full of promises to visit soon. That was weeks ago, and life had taken over as it always did, sweeping him along in its relentless current. But tonight, as the glow of Christmas Eve began to soften the world, Mark was finally coming home. Back on Maple Lane, Helen shifted in her chair, the creaking of the floorboards underneath a soundtrack to her thoughts. Her fingers absently stroked Clara's fur, the rhythmic motions soothing her restlessness. The cat's ears perked at every small noise, the distant bark of a dog, the muffled sounds of carolers in the next block. Claire was always alert, always listening. Tonight, her eyes shone brighter than usual, flicking from shadow to shadow as if sensing something in the wind. At that moment, Helen felt an inexplicable chill run down her spine. It wasn't just the cold seeping in through the gaps in the window frame. It was something deeper, a whisper of intuition that seemed to come from nowhere. She looked down at Clara, who had lifted her head, ears pricked forward, eyes locked on the darkness beyond the glass. The cat's body tensed, a low rumble beginning in her chest. "What's gotten into you, Clara?" Helen murmured, trying to push away the sudden tightness in her chest. But Clara's gaze remained fixed, her pupils wide and wild. In that heartbeat of silence, the quiet street outside began to stir. A low rumble, far in the distance at first, began to grow louder, the sound of tires skidding on ice. The calm of the night fractured as headlights cut through the darkness, blindingly bright and heading fast towards the corner where Helen's house stood. And in the next moment, everything changed. Time seemed to slow as the piercing sound of tires screeching on ice filled the quiet night. The headlights that shattered the darkness outside Helen's window grew larger, more menacing with each passing second. A sickening realization gripped her heart as she struggled to comprehend the chaos unfolding before her eyes. The car was spinning out of control, sliding across the frozen street toward her house at an alarming speed. Clara sprang from Helen's lap with a sharp yowl, her body a blur as she dashed across the room and out through the small cat door Helen had installed by the kitchen. The sudden movement startled Helen, who clutched at the armrests of her chair, too stunned to stand. The wind howled outside, whipping through the open space left by Clara's departure and chilling Helen to her core. For a moment, Helen sat frozen in place, every fiber of her being straining to make sense of the scene outside. The car's tires continued to scream as they skidded, the driver fighting desperately for control. It wasn't until she saw the figure of an elderly man crossing the street, bundled in a heavy coat and moving at a glacial pace, that the true horror dawned on her. It was Mr. Jenkins, her neighbor of nearly 30 years, who shuffled along with the help of a cane, oblivious to the speeding vehicle bearing down on him. "John," Helen's voice cracked as she tried to scream, but it was lost in the cacophony of metal and ice. Panic surged through her body, igniting her muscles into action. She struggled to her feet, her heart hammering in her chest. Helplessly, she pressed her palm against the cold window pane, watching as seconds stretched into eternity. Just then, a streak of orange, black, and white darted into the road. It was Clara, her fur fluffed up against the biting cold and her eyes locked onto the staggering form of Mr. Jenkins. The cat moved with a grace and determination that belied her size, her paws barely touching the icy ground as she sped toward the old man. Inside the car, Mark's heart pounded as he fought to regain control of the wheel. The road, slick from the day's freezing rain, refused to yield, and the world outside blurred in a whirl of snow and panic. He could barely register the figures ahead, the old man in the street, the flash of movement low to the ground, before he felt the jolt as his tires found a patch of rougher asphalt. The car shifted under his grip, narrowly missing the man but barreling straight toward the yard and the porch beyond. Outside, Clara reached Mr. Jenkins just as the car slid past, the whoosh of displaced air ruffling her fur. She leapt at his legs, her small body colliding with him in a burst of movement. The unexpected impact startled Mr. Jenkins, and he stumbled backward just as the car's momentum carried it into the snowbank at the edge of Helen's property, where it came to a groaning halt. The shriek of bending metal finally ceased, leaving behind a stark, aching silence. For a moment, no one moved. The world seemed suspended, as if holding its breath. Then Helen rushed to the front door, her legs trembling beneath her as she fumbled with the lock. The night air stung her face as she stepped outside, the sharpness of it pulling a gasp from her lungs. "John," she cried, her voice quivering. Mr. Jenkins stood a few feet away, dazed but unharmed. His cane lay discarded on the ground, a thin line of steam rising from his breath as he turned toward her, wide-eyed. "But I'm all right," he said, his voice hoarse with disbelief. He looked down and blinked, seeing Clara sitting on the icy ground at his feet, her tail flicking as she surveyed the aftermath. For a second, he seemed unable to process the small creature that had appeared like a guardian angel in the dark. "Clara." Helen's relief was palpable, and tears pricked at her eyes as the cat turned to look at her, green eyes calm and knowing. But the moment was cut short by the sound of a car door creaking open. Helen's gaze shifted to the vehicle resting half-buried in the snow. The driver's side door swung out slowly, and a figure stumbled into the light of the porch. "Mom?" The voice was familiar, frayed with exhaustion and fear. Helen's heart stilled as she recognized Mark. Her son, standing there in the cold, eyes wide with worry. He looked between her and the damage he had narrowly avoided inflicting. His breath came in shallow gasps, each one visible in the frosty night. "Mark," she whispered, and the tears that had threatened finally spilled over. The shock and relief tangled in her chest, leaving her weak and overwhelmed. Clara, as if sensing that her part in this sudden drama was done, moved silently through the snow, rubbing briefly against Mark's leg before bounding up the porch steps to sit beside Helen. She lifted her head, her expression regal and watchful as if daring the world to test her again. Mark closed the distance between them in a few swift steps, his arms pulling Helen into a tight embrace. The warmth of his coat against her cheek, the solid weight of him, was something she hadn't felt in years. It was as if the walls she had built around herself in his absence crumbled in that instant, leaving her vulnerable and alive all at once. "I'm here, Mom," he murmured, voice tight with unshed tears. "I made it." Behind them, Mr. Jenkins shuffled over, leaning down with difficulty to pick up his cane. He looked at the trio on the porch, his eyes glistening with gratitude and something more, something that recognized the sheer miracle of what had just happened. And sitting amidst them all, with her fur now damp and matted, Clara watched with eyes that had seen so much more than any of them could know. She blinked once, slowly, before curling her tail around her feet and allowing a deep purr to rise in her throat, a sound as steady as the heartbeats that surrounded her. The night air, sharp and bracing, carried with it the echoes of everything that had just transpired. Helen stood with Mark's arms wrapped around her, the world beginning to reassemble itself piece by piece in the aftermath of near disaster. Clara, perched on the porch step like a sentry, seemed to understand that her work was far from done. There was something in the depth of her eyes, a knowledge that the night held yet another test. Mark released his hold, stepping back just enough to look at his mother's face. Lines of worry and weariness were etched deep, but so too were those marks of strength Helen had worn all her life. He traced them now with eyes full of guilt. For years, his job and his life in California had kept him away, promising himself that there would always be more time. More time to visit, to talk, to sit at this very porch and share stories with his mother like they once did. But time, he now realized, was as slippery as the ice beneath their feet. "I'm so sorry, Mom," Mark whispered, the admission catching in his throat. Helen squeezed his arm, her hand trembling with emotion but strong in its reassurance. "You're here now. That's what matters," she said, her voice soft and hoarse. A shiver raced down Helen's spine, though it had nothing to do with the cold. There was still a sense of unease in the air, something unspoken but heavy. Clara's ears twitched as if she, too, sensed it. The cat turned her head sharply, eyes narrowing as they fixed on the road. Out of the darkness came the sound of another car approaching, its engine rumbling with an unfamiliar, aggressive note. The headlights pierced the night, more erratic and impatient than Mark's had been. It was a black sedan, and as it barreled down Maple Lane, it became clear that it wasn't slowing down. In fact, it seemed to speed up as it drew closer, the engine roaring louder with each second. "Mark?" Helen said, a spike of fear cutting through her voice. Mark turned, his body going rigid as the car surged forward. Clara was already moving, slipping between them and leaping down the steps as the sedan swerved. The driver's silhouette was a blur, and Mark's shout was swallowed by the scream of the tires. It all happened in an instant. The car skidded, its rear wheels catching on the ice and sliding out. It fishtailed toward the opposite sidewalk, where Mr. Jenkins stood frozen, eyes wide and hands clutching his cane so hard his knuckles turned white. Clara sprinted toward Mr. Jenkins with all the power her tiny frame could muster, her paws churning the snow into a frothy blur. With one fierce leap, she launched herself at his shins, yowling as she collided with them. The sudden impact pushed the old man sideways, just as the black sedan's rear bumper skimmed past where he had been standing. The car's momentum sent it crashing into a lamppost at the corner of Maple Lane, the metallic sound of impact ringing out into the frozen night. The seconds that followed were an eerie tableau of disbelief. The driver of the sedan, a young man with a dazed expression, stumbled out of the vehicle, eyes darting around as if trying to piece together what had just happened. His mouth moved, forming words that no one could hear over the pounding of their own heartbeats. Mr. Jenkins lay sprawled in the snow, Clara beside him, her small body heaving with the effort it had taken. The old man's chest rose and fell in quick, shallow breaths as he looked down at the cat, whose eyes met his with a fierce determination that defied explanation. He lifted a hand to touch her head, fingers shaking as they brushed the soft fur. "You saved me," he said, voice thick with awe. A moment later, Mark and Helen were at his side, helping him to sit up as Mark cast a wary glance toward the young driver, who now sat on the curb with his head in his hands. The town's silence felt brittle, as though it might shatter at the slightest touch. Helen reached for Clara, scooping her up into her arms. The cat allowed it, though her eyes never stopped scanning the street, as if ready for the next threat. She trembled slightly, but the low, soothing purr that rose in her throat signaled she was unhurt. The warmth of her small body pressed against Helen's chest brought with it a rush of gratitude so intense it almost knocked the breath out of her. "It's okay, my love," Helen whispered into the soft fur, her own heart slowing its frantic rhythm. Tears mixed with the cold air, stinging her cheeks as she blinked them away. Mr. Jenkins, with Mark's help, stood on unsteady legs. His eyes glistened with more than just the reflection of the streetlight overhead. He took a shaky breath and looked at Helen, a smile breaking through the lines of shock on his face. "That cat of yours is something else, Helen," he said, voice cracking with emotion. "She always has been," Helen replied, her voice barely a whisper. From the porch steps, a few of the neighbors who had ventured out in curiosity began to approach, their breath visible in the winter air. Murmurs of disbelief and concern rippled through the small crowd, eyes flicking from the crashed sedan to Mr. Jenkins and then to the tiny cat in Helen's arms, whose eyes remained as steady and bright as ever. Mark turned back to his mother, eyes softened by the enormity of what had just taken place. He reached out, his fingers brushing the top of Clara's head before cupping Helen's hand. The connection was electric, a silent promise that things would change. No longer would he let distance and time cheat them of moments like this, moments that so narrowly escaped slipping into tragedy. The young driver, now surrounded by concerned murmurs, lifted his head, eyes meeting Helen's for a brief moment. Whatever anger or judgment might have existed dissolved under the shared understanding that tonight had held more than one miracle. For tonight, amidst the ice and fear, a small cat with an indomitable spirit had given them all a gift that few could ever hope to receive, the gift of another chance. As the wind eased and the snowflakes resumed their silent dance, Clara's purr deepened, resonating not just in Helen's chest but in the hearts of everyone present. The night, once fractured and cold, began to mend under the gentle weight of gratitude and wonder. The night settled into an uneasy calm as emergency responders arrived on the scene. The flashing red and blue lights painted the street in pulses of color, a stark contrast to the soft, silvery glow of the snow that had started falling again. The air buzzed with activity, the voices of paramedics checking on Mr. Jenkins, the murmurs of curious onlookers who had gathered at the edge of the scene, and the crackle of a police radio as officers approached the young driver who had finally stood up, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Mark hovered near Helen, a protective arm around her shoulders as she held Clara close. The cat was uncharacteristically still, her green eyes absorbing every movement, every sound. She could feel the tightness in Helen's embrace, the tremor in her chest that spoke of relief and lingering fear. Clara's purr had quieted, but the steady rhythm of Helen's heartbeat beneath her paws was comfort enough. "Let's get you inside, Mom," Mark said gently. His voice was warm, pulling her attention away from the scene that continued to unfold. Helen looked up at him, taking in the lines of concern on his face, the weariness that came not just from the long drive but from the emotional toll of the night. She nodded, finally willing to let herself lean on him, to allow the comfort she had been starved of for so long. As they made their way up the porch steps, Mr. Jenkins called out, "Helen, we..." His voice, though weary, carried a depth of gratitude that halted her steps. He approached slowly, cane tapping out a rhythm in the snow. "I just wanted to thank you. And thank Clara." His eyes fell to the cat nestled in her arms, and a smile cracked through the seriousness of his expression. "She saved my life," he said, eyes misting over as the truth settled on him like a warm blanket. "If not for her..." He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. The fragility of life had never felt so pronounced. Helen felt her throat tighten, emotion bubbling up in a way that made words impossible. Instead, she reached out her free hand and squeezed his arm, the simple gesture speaking volumes. Clara let out a soft meow, as if to say, "It's all in a day's work." Mark guided Helen inside, the door closing behind them and muffling the sounds from outside. The warmth of the house enveloped them, and for a moment, they stood in the quiet, their breaths synchronized as they took in what had just happened. The living room, still lit by the soft glow of the Christmas tree, seemed almost surreal now, a sanctuary untouched by the drama that had played out beyond its walls. Mark looked around the room, memories flooding back of Christmases spent opening presents on the rug, the smell of cinnamon and pine filling the air, and his mother's laughter ringing through the halls. He hadn't realized how much he missed it, how much he'd let slip through the cracks of his busy life. "I missed this," he said softly, breaking the silence. Helen turned to him, her eyes searching his face. She saw the boy he once was, the man he'd become, and the promise of the son who had finally come home. "I missed you," she whispered, her voice trembling with more than just the weight of the night. Mark's expression shifted, the guilt and regret melting into something warmer, something that felt like hope. He reached out, taking Clara from Helen's arms and holding the cat close. "Looks like I owe you, Clara," he said, scratching behind her ears. Clara's eyes met his, the emerald depths filled with an unreadable intelligence. She blinked slowly, a gesture that felt almost like a nod of acknowledgement. Then, with the grace of a queen, she leaped from Mark's arms onto the couch, curling into a tight ball as if to say, "My work here is done." They settled into the living room, the adrenaline of the night gradually giving way to exhaustion. Mark sat beside his mother, their shoulders touching, the warmth between them a silent truce. Clara's purr filled the space, the sound resonant and comforting. "You know," Mark said after a moment, "this cat might just be a guardian angel." He chuckled softly, the sound a balm to Helen's frayed nerves. "She's always been special," Helen replied, her gaze drifting to the small, sleeping bundle of fur. "Ever since that day she wandered into my garden. It's like she knew I needed her." They sat in silence for a while, the room filled with the soft hum of the heater and the occasional crackle from the fireplace. The chaos outside began to dissipate, the police and paramedics completed their work, the curious onlookers returned to their homes, and the young driver was led to an ambulance, where he would be checked for shock and injuries. As the street emptied, it was as if the night exhaled, finally releasing its tension. Mark glanced at his mother, the lines on her face softened by the golden glow of the Christmas tree. He saw the resilience there, the quiet strength that had carried her through the years without him. And he made a silent vow, never again would he let distance and time erode what truly mattered. "I'll stay through the holidays, Mom," he said, breaking the quiet. "And after that, I'll come more often. I promise." Helen's eyes glistened with unshed tears, a smile breaking through as she nodded. "I'd like that very much, Mark." The hours stretched into the early morning, the fatigue of the night finally giving way to a peaceful drowsiness. Mark helped Helen to bed, tucking her in with a tenderness that brought them both a sense of peace. Clara followed, hopping up onto the bed and curling into the crook of Helen's knees, her purr a gentle lullaby. As Mark turned off the light, leaving only the soft glow of the street lamp filtering through the curtains, he paused at the door. He watched his mother's breathing slow as sleep claimed her, and Clara's ears flicked once before settling back down. It was as if the cat, always vigilant, was reassuring him that everything was as it should be. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the town of Providence in a blanket of white, softening the edges of the night's memories. The car tracks and the chaos would be erased by morning, but the story of the little cat who saved Christmas Eve would remain, etched into the hearts of those who had witnessed it. And as sleep finally overtook Mark in the chair beside the bed, Clara opened one eye, casting a watchful glance at the two most important people in her world. The night was quiet, but her heart was steady, ready for whatever might come next. The dawn of Christmas morning arrived softly, the sky painted in shades of rose and gold. The events of the night before felt suspended in the hush that comes just before the world awakens. Helen stirred first, her eyelids fluttering open to the muted light spilling through the curtains. The warmth at her feet reminded her she was not alone. Clara was there, a tiny guardian whose loyalty had reshaped the night and, in many ways, her heart. Helen's gaze drifted to the chair by her bedside, where Mark sat slumped, the gentle rise and fall of his chest steady in sleep. The exhaustion on his face looked softer now, the hard lines of worry softened in the calm of the early morning. Helen reached out, her fingers brushing the edge of his hand, careful not to wake him. It was a simple touch, but it carried with it a deep gratitude that words could never fully capture. A small rumble from Clara's chest brought Helen's attention back to the cat. Clara's emerald eyes blinked lazily, acknowledging the new day and the peace it carried. Helen smiled, the kind of smile that blooms slowly, filling the crevices carved by years of loneliness and longing. This Christmas was already the greatest gift she could have hoped for, the return of her son and the safety of those she loved. Mark shifted, waking to find his mother watching him. He rubbed his eyes, taking a moment to register where he was. When the realization hit, a smile spread across his face, mirrored by hers. "Merry Christmas, Mom," he said, his voice thick with the morning. "Merry Christmas, Mark," she replied, the words infused with more meaning than ever before. Clara stretched and jumped down from the bed, padding over to Mark and pressing her head against his leg in a rare display of affection. It was her way of acknowledging that this moment, these fragile, precious connections, were worth protecting. She glanced up at him, eyes wise and knowing, before trotting out of the room, her tail flicking in satisfaction. Helen watched her go, the purr still resonating in her memory. It was a sound of contentment, a testament to a miracle that had saved them all, not just from the dangers of a winter night, but from the isolation that had kept their hearts apart. Outside, the snow glistened like diamonds under the rising sun, erasing the chaos and fear of Christmas Eve. But inside, a story had taken root, a story of love, redemption, and a small cat whose courage proved that sometimes the greatest guardians come in the smallest forms.